To say that there is a broad mainstream. Now, I'm not happy with everything in the broad mainstream, but the broad mainstream is not heretical. The broad mainstream does not believe that Gentiles should live a Jewish life, because there are people teaching that. The broad mainstream does not believe that Christians are really the descendants of the lost tribes. That's the Ephraimite movement. If you've never heard of that, you are blessedly ignorant. Ignorance can be a blessing. And that's a whole movement that's grown up that I think mostly is to undercut what God is doing through the Messianic Jews. True Christians are really the physical descendants of the lost tribes, and they need to come back and identify as Israel. It's a partial replacement theology. Then there are people that get into very heavy orthodoxy as a way of living and identifying with Jews, so they become more rabbinic than the rabbinics, except for the Haredim. Nobody can outdo them in Israel. But these are aberrations. What I say to people is, there is a broad mainstream. And even if there are areas where I'm corrective and critical of the broad mainstream is not heretical, and they're not off the deep end. You find the broad mainstream in the primary movement in Israel, of the 120 or so congregations there. You find the broad mainstream in the movement that was raised up out of the campaigns of Jonathan Bernis in Russia, in Ukraine, that represents about 100 congregations there. You find that mainstream in the German, Russian congregations under the leadership of Vladimir Pickman. You find the broad mainstream in America under Tikkun, the Messianic Jewish Alliance, and Tikkun, the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. In any of those organizations, you're not going to find this over-the-edge craziness. You'll find things to criticize, for sure, but you're not going to find that craziness. And I would say, stick with the broad mainstream. Don't credit these off things. It's a shame because on the internet, everything can gain traction. Every crazy thing can gain traction. There is a viewpoint that almost 50 years ago everybody accepted, and now it's controversial because the way scholarship works, somebody's always going to come up with a reason why what the past scholars thought isn't true today. But some people still think it's correct. After Jerusalem fell, Jewish believers were still part of synagogues with people that were not believers. And the thought is that in Yavna, which is a town not far from Tel Aviv, and you can go to the ruins there and go see where it was, there was a gathering of rabbinic leaders, the early rabbinic movement under Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was one of the most revered early rabbis, we're talking about the year 90, who suggested that someone write a curse in the midst of the blessings on the minim, or the heretics. And many scholars believe that the minim originally was the Nazarenes, or the Notzrim, which were the believers in Yeshua, and that they wrote this curse into the prayer. Some thought it was a completely new benediction. The professors I had in the Jewish school where I went after seminary thought it was an addition to the 12th benediction, not a completely new one. And that if a Jewish believer was in the synagogue, he couldn't stand up and pray this prayer and pray a curse down on himself. He'd be identified and then could be excluded from the synagogue. There are today scholars that don't think that was really the nature of it. They don't think that the controversy and the rejection of the Messianic Jews was yet that strong as to have put that, and that they think that maybe it was written about the Sadducees and some of the other people that were considered not as much the Messianic Jews. So there's controversy today. I would say 50-50, could have been, maybe not. It's not so important that it definitely had to be, but if you were to study anything in scholarship 50 years ago, that was, standard. First of all, if you get to know me, you'll find I'm driven by the implications of the biblical text. If I see it in the biblical text, it has to work, even if it's not working in our working it out. We're missing something. I just am captured by the biblical text. So whatever else goes on, the Word says, and that's it. So to me, the Word says that Jews are called to live and identify as part of their people. That settles it. I need some kind of sociological framework to encourage that, or it's not going to happen. Now, what happened in the Messianic Jewish movement is that in the 80s, the movement was predominantly Jewish. And I actually believe, and we always wanted to have people that were not Jewish, who are called to live a life of witness before the Jewish people. I personally believe that Messianic Jews and Messianic Gentiles, that there are a number of Gentiles who have as their primary call a call to the Jewish people. Not all Gentiles have that call. Not all Christians have that call. Some are called primarily to France or to Russia or the inner city of New York. And but every person who's a believer in Yeshua should have this peace on their heart. And I'm going to get into that in a minute in terms of what we've learned. So, yes, we want members that are not Jewish who are genuinely called to the Jewish people. But what happened in the later 1980s and into the 90s was a switch took place, and I think we were blindsided, and we did not vet the people that were joining us, because many Gentiles were joining us on the basis of the Messianic Jewish congregation being the ideal form of the church. And in America, we went from being a majority Jewish movement to a majority Gentile movement. Only in America, by the way. In Israel, we're by far vast, 80% Jewish movement, 90%. In Russia, I still think we're a majority Jewish movement in Russia and Ukraine, Germany. But what happened is that Gentiles were reading other things, they were coming to their own conclusions, and they were thinking, you know what, this is the ideal form of the church. We keep the feasts. We don't celebrate pagan Christian holidays like Christmas and Easter. And there grew up in our midst a contingency of people that saw the Messianic Jewish movement not as the movement of Jews coming to faith in Yeshua, which they were supporting, but something for them to be able to say, we have now discovered the truth, the better church over against the Baptists and the Presbyterians and Anglicans and everything else. Now, I want to tell you, I abhor that conclusion. I think it's a wrong way to understand the church. I think it's a wrong way to understand church traditions. I'm going to talk about the Catholics in a minute, and you should know that I'm not a Catholic and I'm not leaning that way, just so you don't get scared. But scholarship is scholarship. But I wanted to say that we as a movement have a lot of work to do to teach against this arrogance against the rest of the church that's grown up not from the Jewish believers as much as from the Gentiles that have joined us. And this has produced a situation where in America we're less effective with the Jewish people. Because Jewish people walk in, they see a bunch of Gentiles that are acting Jewish and claiming to be the ideal form of the church, and this does not excite them. Thankfully, there are a goodly number of Messianic Jewish congregations of whom that is not true, but we've got to face this issue. And we are trying to face this issue in Tikkun, in the Union. I don't know if the Alliance is facing it that much yet, but they need to face it. They can't just go rah, rah, revival's coming. And I hope that it can be turned around. But I think that one of the things that God has spoken to me about, I believe, is that the center of the movement is moving from the United States to Israel. And Israel is going to bring rebirth and rejuvenation to the whole nature of what is Messianic Jewish. We're not there yet, but that Israel is going to be my answer. And I think it's why God plucked me up, who had been a leader in the movement here in the States for, over 30 years, 33 years, and plucked me up and planted me over there.
And just
well, it's funny, I was talking to Patty about this. It certainly seems like the lineup of the nations against Israel looks an awful lot like the second coming. You know, Derek Prince, in the 1940s, was approached by a friend. He was a new believer, and he was in ministry. And he said to Derek Prince, the founding of the State of Israel will solve the problem of anti-Semitism. Because anti-Semitism is rooted in the fact that Jews are different among the nations, and therefore in the nations the Jews are rejected because of their different. But if they have their own nation and they're not mixed in, they'll be like other nations, and that'll solve the problem. And here's what Derek Prince said. He said, if the problem of anti-Semitism is sociological, you are correct. But if the problem of anti-Semitism is primarily spiritual, the restoration of the Jewish people to their own land and in fulfillment of biblical prophecy will produce the greatest unleashing of anti-Semitism that the world has ever seen. Isn't that amazing? And I'm telling you, even evangelicals are getting caught up in the influences of that. And so, thankfully not as much as other people, but there's a problem in the replacement theology now growing up and among the evangelical world. And so, it looks like we're near the end, the lineup of the nations around Israel. But I said something to Patty there, but I said, you know, Patty, I really believe we've got to have 144,000 Jewish believers in Israel. And God could do this very quickly by revelation, supernatural, preaching of the gospel. And she said, yeah, but maybe it's the Jewish believers over the years. And listen, I don't discount true Jewish people that became believers in Yeshua and didn't know any better and assimilated. But they really believed in Yeshua. I still think God counts them as a saved remnant and are still part of the sanctifying of Israel, even though. But, so Patty said, maybe the 100.